Hi everyone, my name is Kira Smith and this is my presentation on sex, gender identity, and gender expression. So these are a couple definitions of words that'll come up through the presentation that I really think you should know about just to make it a little bit easier. The first one is sex, which is the two main distinctions that people are assigned and separated in based on their reproductions upon birth. For us, this is male and female. Gender identity is what a person identifies as regardless of their birth sex. Gender expression is the way that people express that gender through dress, behavior, and actions. Pronouns are the terms we use to describe people in conversations: she, her, he, him, they, them, etc. Some people also use a combination of she, they, he, she. It really just can go anyway. Transgender is a person who transitions from their birth sex to another gender, male to female, female to male, or somewhere in between. Drag is a performance art in which a person dresses up as an exaggerated form of either male or female expression, and they are often associated with lip syncings, impressions, and dancing. A really common example of this is going to be RuPaul's Drag Race. Non-binary are people who don't identify as either gender or identify as both at the same time or anywhere in between that. They just don't fit into that binary category of male and female. Gender dysphoria is dissatisfaction with one's current assigned gender. A little bit about treatment of people who don't fall into the gender binary or are transgender. They're treated really poorly in American politics. These are just a few of the bills that have either passed in states or are up for conversation as of 2022. The Save Women's Sports Act, which is the banning of transgender women from women's sports. And the other is Don't Say Gay, which is really big in media right now. It just passed in Florida, and this is not going to allow the discussion of gender expression, sexuality in any age younger than third grade. Some religious participants also shun people who don't follow the gender binary and LGBTQ plus in general. Not all people and not all religions, but there are many. Transgender people are viewed as sick, and we'll get into that a little bit later as to why that is historically. And there's also a lack of media representation for non-binary and trans people. As well as there is a huge amount of representation for the gender binary, which we'll talk a little bit about in the case study later. The history of gender identity. I chose two main topics for this. One is the challenging of sex versus gender identity, and it goes back almost as far as recorded history. According to an article by theconversation.com, people who do not fit into the gender binary have been cited in native cultures as far back as anyone can remember. So in the Polynesian culture, this is called mahu, or people who are in a gender between male and female or gender fluid. Also in Native American cultures, there are two-spirited people, again, who embody both male and female, and often these are considered some of the wisest members of the tribe. In the 1980s, those who didn't understand transgender individuals named it as a disorder. Dr. Laura McGuire talks about this on SpectrumSouth.com, which is a really great website to talk about those who are on the LGBT spectrum and are in the South in more conservative states. They listed it as gender identity disorder in the DSM, which is basically a log of all known medical conditions. It has now been categorized as gender dysphoria, which again, we talked about a little bit earlier. But because of that stigma, all of these people were taught that it's a sickness, it's an illness, it's something that can be cured. It's not something about who someone is. There are three events that I thought were really important to talk about during sex and gender identity. The first recorded gender-confirming surgery was performed on Lily Elbe, a Danish painter. Elbe was assigned female at birth and underwent 5 surgeries to transition. Lily unfortunately passed away about a year after all of those, and during the time before the surgeries, she presented both as her born male self and her female self. Christine Jorgensen is the first American celebrity that is openly transgender. Jorgensen also served in World War II as a man and then transitioned when she came back to the States. She is a really popular model for a photographer in that time, so it's really interesting. You can go and look her up. She has a lot of beautiful portraits done of her. And then the last one is Jamie Shoup, who becomes the first person in the US to be officially identified as non-binary in 2015 in Oregon. He later reversed his decision, but the right was still awarded in 2015, and that's the most important part. Not that Shoup reversed his decision, but that the judge allowed for that to happen. So that is the most important part of that. So we have in here, the 1930s, which is when people were starting to do gender-confirming surgery to transition, and then all the way to 2015 when someone can finally identify as outside of male or female. So like I talked about a little bit earlier, the case study I looked at was from chapter 4. It's about Lisa Espinoza, who taught a lesson on gender to her 7th graders. The 7th graders seemed to agree on generic ideas about the two main genders that we present in society, boys and girls. Boys being tough and girls being strong and soft. And however, they discussed this idea more in class, and the students seemed to understand that their perception of gender was taught to them. It was things that they saw in media and they saw in television shows, and that they were just told was what it was. Because when Miss Espinoza asked them, students who were female would relate to liking football like the boys, and students who were male would like to cook, like the girls are supposed to do. They also had family members and friends who did things that were stereotypical to the opposite gender. I thought that was really interesting because, again, it talks about how the idea of the two genders that we have is so ingrained in our society and so taught to us. So these are just a couple of stereotypes that I find to be the most prevalent, as well as ones that I've asked friends and coworkers. Trans people are just trying to creep on people of the opposite sex. Transition is a lot of work for someone just trying to creep. It really is. A lot of people who are very serious about transition begin hormones and conversion therapy, and, they go through conversion surgeries, and it's so expensive and often not covered by insurance. Drag queens and kings are transgender. This isn't true. It's just people who perform in drag feel beautiful in their skin when they're in drag, so they are able to eliminate their gender dysphoria by performing in drag. The idea that pronouns are a fad, pronouns are a part of our language structure. So it's a part of how we speak. It's not a fad. It's just something we haven't really talked about as a choice before because it was just given to us. The other thing, gender exploration being a fad, I think that gender exploration is being talked about now more than ever because we are having an open conversation about it. I don't think it's a fad. I think it's something that's always been there, but we just haven't really discussed it, and we haven't really been able to talk about it as a society. Again, like I mentioned earlier, transgender and non-binary people are sick. That's just because of outdated ideas from the 1980s. And again, that non-binary is a new idea, whereas we know based on historical culture and documentation that we have that this is an idea that has been around for a really, really long time. How to work with your students. Be respectful if your student asks you to use opposite pronouns other than the ones that you think that they should have. Just go with it, and they may change, and that's okay because students are still figuring themselves out. They have a lot of emotions and just a little bit of their body and a little bit of time. Hold your students responsible for using students' correct pronouns. That's really important. You want to make sure that not only are you holding yourself responsible, but you're holding your students responsible. And it's okay for you and your students to mess up, but you have to make sure that you're taking proactive choice to make students feel welcomed in your classroom. Introduce a variety of books with differing perspectives on gender expression. There is a book called Jack Not Jackie about a little girl dealing with her brother transitioning at a young age, and another one called My Shadow is Pink, where this little boy has a typically feminine shadow, pink, and his dad, who has a blue and masculine shadow, doesn't quite understand. So I think those are some really good books, especially for young children, to introduce gender expression to them. Make your pronouns clear to your students if you feel comfortable. Personally, I use she, her pronouns, and I also wear a she, her name tag at work, so people know my pronouns. I'm very open with it. I know that not everybody is. If a student asks you to use a new name, just use it even if it changes. Again, it's just like a nickname. It's just something that's helping them figure themselves out. Let students know that your classroom is a safe space for gender expression. I think that's something that's really important, and by introducing your pronouns to them, I think students will understand that your room is, somewhere that they can talk to you about it. If you feel comfortable, allow your students to confide in you about their gender, and be sure to ask if you want to use their pronouns in front of their family. I have a cousin who is non-binary to me, but to the rest of my family, they still go by she, because that's how they feel safe. And so to me, and when I talk to them, they are they, but to the rest of my family, they are a she. And that's okay, because the most important thing is keeping them safe. And then these are my references that I have for this whole presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day.